The speaking part 3 of the IELTS test is one that throws up a lot of challenges for most non-native users of the English language. This is because this is a part that is called the discussion area or an interview area. Here, you will be asked abstract questions that will be derived from the topic that you talked about in your part 2. There's a very huge chance that here you will be thrown questions that you do not have any idea about. It is perfectly okay to be clueless about some of the questions that will be asked in the part 3, as we have seen this happen a lot of times. You can prepare for the part 3, but it will be very, how would I say it, impossible for you to exhaust all the possibilities or the types of questions that could be asked in your part 3. So what can you do to prepare for it? What can you do to ensure that you get that desired score that you want in the speaking part 3 of the IELTS test? Please come along with me and I will share those success strategies and tips with you that I would advise you to please practice as much as possible before you do take the test. The speaking part 3 has a total duration of between 4 to 5 minutes, and it's called the interview or the discussion part of the IELTS. Here, you will be asked to predict, analyze, compare, give opinion. Predict, analyze, compare, or give your opinion about a particular concept or a particular topic or a particular view or a particular claim or concept that will be assigned to you. Here, the theme is always related to what you discussed in your part 2. So what implications does this have for you? It means that immediately you get your cue card for the long term in your part 2, you can as well start predicting the type of questions that you will get in your part 3. I'll take that again. Once you get your cue card for your long term in your part 2, you can start predicting the type of questions that you will get in your part 3. And how do you do this? If I get a question that has to do with museums, immediately my mind starts dredging up all the vocabulary or all the things that I know about museums, about art, and about appreciation of history. Because I know that chances are that when I get to my part 3, 1 or 2 of these areas will come up in the questions that will be asked. If I get a question about describing a shopping mall that I have visited in my part 2, I do know that in my part 3, I will be talking about shopping as it deals with a lot of people, or the concept of buying and selling, or even the concept of advertising. All these are areas that psychologically prepare you for what you will be dealing with in your part 3. And this is an essential part of your journey towards success in the IELTS. You would also be given questions from a range of areas, and the topics include the following: technology, education, environment, TV influence, leisure activities, shopping, sports, transportation, and advertising. I'll take those areas again, and this is not an exhaustive list. You have a lot of areas where the questions could come from, but these are the most commonly asked areas or topics that usually crop up in the IELTS. You have technology, education, the environment, TV influence, leisure activities, shopping, sports, transportation, and advertising. As much as possible, you want to prepare yourself for these topics. And if all of these areas that I've listed out, look at them. Is any of them one of the areas where if I told you that you're supposed to speak about transportation now, would you take a 3 to 5 minutes pause before you can think of something to say? That is an easy test to test yourself if you're prepared to talk about any of these topics. Any of them that would give you a significant 10 to 5 seconds pause before you can think of anything to say about it is one that you should do a lot of research on, because you obviously do not have enough vocabulary or you do not have enough competence to discuss it. A lot of test takers tell me that my tip here contradicts what I said earlier about the IELTS being a test of communication and not a test of intelligence. Yes, it is still a test of communication and not a test of intelligence. Even though the topics here are topics that could task your intelligence, are topics that you may be clueless about, they really do not need you to have some in-depth specialist knowledge about it. So, in the question about technology, nobody will ask you to detail what technology looks like, or to detail or to go ahead and use specialist knowledge terms or to use industry specific terms to describe technology. All they will be asking you will be about your opinion about the use of technology, or your ideas about the general perception towards technology, or you could be asked to compare the use of technology now and in the past, or now and in the future. Comparison is a very integral part of the part 3, and this is something that a lot of people mistake for an intelligence question. No, all they need you to do is to compare a concept as it exists now, or as it exists in the future, or as it used to exist in the past. Or you could be asked to compare a concept as it exists or as it occurs somewhere and in another place, maybe in developed countries and in the developing world. All these comparisons are actually targeted at checking what vocabulary or how you express yourself when you are comparing two or more things. For the comparison that has to do with the past, the present, and the future, obviously your tenses are what will be looked at. And for the comparison that has to do with different places or different time or different people, what will be looked at are what are appropriate vocabulary items that you use to express comparison. But I digress. And then you would also be asked to, how are education priorities different from in the present and in the past? This is just a type of question that could come out for comparison. Now, the comparison part is one that I would like to flesh out a bit also. There's something called a timeline question in the IELTS. A timeline question is a question that requires you to talk about a particular concept or topic across two different time periods. You must use at least two different time periods in talking about that particular concept or topic. And this topic or concept is usually under the comparison aspect of the speaking part 3. So you could be asked a question that says, do you think the kind of houses that people like now has changed from what they used to like in the past? Do you think that in the future more people will rely on ebooks than paperback books? Do you think that a lot of people do you think that the definition of happiness is the same now as it used to be in the future, in the past? Do you think more people will value the same things in society now as they used to do in the past? All these are questions that all fall under the timeline question, the timeline format. And what do I mean by this? In answering these questions, you must try as much as possible to align your answers to show this concept or that topic, how it exists now and it exists before or as it will exist in the future. And in doing this, you're going to rely heavily on your knowledge of tenses. The verbs that convey tense, the verbs that convey the different aspects of tenses are very important for you to use. So in your part 3, your tenses are quite essential and you should watch out for them. The timeline questions are easy questions, but they are questions that give you an opportunity to show off your knowledge of tenses. Do not miss them. The next time you hear a question that has any time element embedded in it, either past, present, future, or now, before, or later, all those words are are words that indicate a time element in a question. Watch out for them and ensure that you use your knowledge of tenses to relate those concepts or those topics to different time zones or different time periods. For example, as the definition of happiness, as the way people perceive happiness changed from the past to now. Or do people see happiness in the same way as they used to in the past? So my answer would be happiness. Nowadays, most people equate happiness with financial freedom. Whereas in the past, people used to think of happiness in terms of how much you have achieved or how well brought up your family is. But nowadays, the reverse is the case. And I believe that in the future, a lot of people will define happiness by the amount of money you have as opposed to what we used to have in the past. I've been able to relate this answer to the three different time elements, and in doing that, I was able to use the particular tenses, the particular words that indicated that I was speaking in the present tense, in the past tense, and I'm also talking about something that would happen in the future. This is a very easy way to get good scores in the IELTS, and you should not disregard the importance of a timeline questions. So, what are the things that you should do in the speaking part 3? Number 1, listen for keywords in the question. Why is this important? The questions in your speaking part 3 are relatively longer than what you get in your part 1 or in your part 2. So there's a tendency that you might hear a question and in starting your answer, you could forget the question itself. So how do you guard against this? Listen for the keywords in the question. So if a question says, has the definition of happiness changed from the past to the present? Your keyword there is what? Happiness. So if a question asks you about what the choices or people's preferences when it comes to building houses, your keyword there is what? Building houses. You must be able to identify a keyword in each question because the keyword is the concept that you will be talking about. You do not want to cram the whole question because some questions are quite long, and you also do not want to put yourself in a situation where you keep on asking the examiner for clarification. I will talk more about clarification and referencing later on because these are essential skills that could be deployed in the speaking test for the IELTS. But you do not want to ask for clarification over and over again. In your part 3, which is a 4 to 5 minute section, you could be asked maybe 7 to 8 questions, and you do not want to ask for clarification in 7 out of 8 questions. This automatically shows the examiner that your communicative competence is not as advanced or developed as you think it is. The next thing is this: ask if you do not understand. Although I mentioned that clarification is important, you do not want to overdo it. But in a culture like in Nigeria, where I come from, a lot of people see asking questions or asking for clarification as a disrespectful thing. In Nigeria, where I come from, asking for clarification from an authority figure like a teacher or an examiner is considered disrespectful. But this is not the case in the IELTS. Please ensure that you are clear about the question that you're answering. Ensure that you understand what has been asked of you before you answer. If you do not understand, ask for clarification. Clarification is an important part of the communication process, and it would not reduce your scores. A lot of people ask me, if I ask for clarification, wouldn't that drop my scores? No, it will only drop your scores when you overdo it. 7 times out of 8 questions you're asking for clarification, definitely this is wrong. But 4 times out of 8 times, 3 times out of 8 times, asking for clarification is not a bad thing at all. You can ask for clarification on a wide range of things. You can ask for a question to be repeated. You can ask for a particular concept for a particular word or expression to be repeated or clarified for you. When asking for clarification, a lot of people ask me, what should I say? Should I say, come again? Should I say, can you repeat yourself? Those expressions, I find them quite impolite. When you're asking for clarification or when you're asking the examiner for clarification, endeavor to use the word could instead of can. Could sounds more polite than can. Can sounds like you're putting a compulsion on the examiner, asking the examiner if he has the capacity to give you that answer or to repeat the question. And that's not what you're doing. What you're asking for is permission. Could you please repeat the question again? Oh, sorry, I didn't get that. Could you repeat it again? Could I take that question again? Could you clarify what you mean by this particular expression? These are the easy ways to ask for clarification. I see a lot of people come up with different formats, words like pardon, words like sorry. Do not just say sorry for the sake of saying sorry. Always ensure that you add something to that word. When you say sorry, ask for clarification. Sorry, I do not understand. Sorry, could we move to the next question? Sorry, I think I've answered the question. Sorry, I think that completely answers the question. Sorry, I think that's all I have to say about that particular question. Sorry alone is not a clarification, and it does not tell the examiner anything. You are not apologizing for anything if you do not add something to the word sorry. Next thing is to give details, examples, and reasons. Why is this important? In your speaking part 3, which is the discussion part, the questions that you will be given are questions that usually will tax your brain more than what you've been given in your part 1 or your part 2. In line with our tip not to give short monosyllabic answers to your questions in the IELTS, you want to expand them. And the easiest ways to expand your answers in the IELTS will be what? Giving examples, giving reasons, or sharing personal experiences to expand. But for the part 3, you do not want to rely too much on personal experiences, as the part 3 questions are actually more of opinion questions, but they are opinion questions at a much more general level than the part 1 questions. So for example, a question in part 1 could be, do you like football or do you like sports? In part 3, that question would now be changed to, why do people like sports? Do people in your country like sports? That question cannot be answered by saying, personally, I like sports. If you say, personally, I like sports, you have changed the direction of the question. If you are, or if you must use your personal perspective to answer the question, always find a way to still link it to the general opinion. So, personally, I like sports, and I believe a lot of people in my country reason the way that I do. So I would say, yes, most people in my country like sports. That way, I have been able to take my personal experience and link it to what people to a much more general population, what they think about sports, instead of just sticking to just my own personal experience. Remember, in the speaking part 3, you need to be as vocal, you need to produce as much information as possible if you want to get that desired score. Next is for you to stick to the topic. Please, as much as possible, because the questions in your part 3 might be technical, might be difficult, might be disturbing. A lot of people tend to veer off the topic. Please do not veer off topic. If you do not understand, or if you're not clear about what you want to talk about, ask for clarification before you answer. Do not just jump into a question because you feel ashamed asking for clarification, or you do not want the examiner to think that you do not understand English language. Ask for clarification. It is better to ask for clarification and be cleared on what you want to say than to just jump into an answer and give a very beautiful speech that says nothing. Next, you should also think that you will do well. This is a psychological tip. Thinking that you will do well obviously will translate into you doing well. But if you start the exam with this panic, or you start the exam with this self-loathing or self-hate, thinking already, defeating yourself that you will not do well, chances are that no matter how brilliant you are, no matter how prepared you are, you still will not do well. So psychologically, prepare yourself for the speaking part 3 and engage in that mental prep where you tell yourself that I'm going to be talking about so thing that I talked about in part 2, and here I will do this, and I will try as much as possible to put my best foot forward and give a good showing of myself, or give a good account of my communicative prowess. Next thing is to build vocabulary beforehand. And I told you earlier how to build vocabulary beforehand for your part 3. This is what, by looking at the question that you're given in part 2, in between the time where the examiner stops your part 2 the section 2 of the speaking of the IELTS, and you move to part 3, you should, as much as possible, start playing around with different vocabulary items that relate to the particular topic that you have been asked in your part 2. Also, relate the question to your own life. I also gave a tip earlier too, that if you're going to use your personal experience or you're going to relate it to your own life, as much as possible, do not forget to also connect it to a general perspective. Please, you do not want to just use your own personal experiences alone to answer questions in your section 3 in the IELTS. And finally, you should also divide up your answers. Divide up your answers. What do I mean by dividing up your answers? This is where I told you that even if you're going to use personal experiences, ensure that you still bring in the general perspective. That is dividing your answers. So you know that every time you're giving a question in your part 3, you will use a personal experience and also relate it to a general perspective. That is already 2 divisions for your answers. As much as possible, stick to this format, and this will assure you of the desired score that you want in the IELTS, which is most predictably your band 9 or your band 8.5. And finally, use modals. What are modal verbs? Modal verbs are helping verbs. They are also called auxiliary verbs that help nouns, or that help verbs to convey or express nuances in the action performed in a sentence or in a context. There are words like can, could, would, will, may, might, should, shall, ought to, and must to. Now, please, you must, as much as possible, you should, as much as possible, know how to use these modals or use these auxiliary verbs correctly. they convey different shades of meaning, and knowing the different shades of meaning that they convey will help you significantly in the test. And why is it important to use modals? Most times in your part 3, you will be asked questions that require you to give absolute answers. And you should know that it is a mark of a good communicator not to put themselves in a position where they have to give absolute answers that do not leave room for exceptions. So, for example, if the question says that, do you think that ebooks will completely replace paperback books in the future? Of course, you do not, an answer that says that, yes, I think they will completely replace paperback books in the future is not such a good answer, because we do know that there are no absolutes in life and there are always exceptions to every rule. So a perfect answer to that question could be that while ebooks are gaining prominence nowadays, there is a very likely chance that they will still coexist with paperback books in the future, as paperback books will never go out of circulation because some people will still love them and they may not be able to even read a book without holding it in their hands or having a physical feel of what you're reading. This ensures that while paperback books might reduce in popularity, they will always still coexist with ebooks even in the future, even if it's 1,000 years in the future. Finally, also to learn how to express your opinion. Learn opinion expressions. Opinion expressions from my own point of view, from where I stand, from my stand, in my own opinion. Personally, I think, I believe, I know, I would assume. Knowing all these expressions that indicate opinion are very, very important ways for you to get good scores in the IELTS. Lastly, when you are answering a question that you do not have so much in-depth knowledge about, it is okay to let the examiner know that you are answering from a weak point. So, for example, do you think museums should be paid businesses, or should they be run as a public service? For example, now, I've never been to a museum, I do not know much about museums, and I'm supposed to answer that question. I will start my answer by saying that that's an interesting question. While I do not know much about museums, I do know that museums are places where historical artifacts are kept, and learning history is important in determining the future. So I would think that since learning history is so important, it should be something that should be free for everyone to access. That way, I think museums should be public service much more than a paid business venture. That way, I have started from the beginning, indicating to the examiner that I do not have so much idea about museums, and I also use the word assume, which shows that I am working from a very weak stand and it is just an assumption. But I have also been able to convey what I feel, and the most important thing in IELTS is how you express yourself, not what you are expressing itself. The content is not as important as the medium of expression. So you want to put a lot of focus on the medium of expression much more than the content of what you were saying, which is why I would stress again, it is a test of communication, not a test of intelligence. So what are the things that you should not do? The don'ts for the speaking part 3. Do not memorize answers. I've said this before, I would say it again, and this is very, very relevant irrespective of whatever section that you are dealing with in the IELTS. Do not memorize answers. Do not worry if you make mistakes. Do not worry if you make mistakes. Do not worry if you make mistakes. This is a very, very important tip that a lot of people disregard or they cannot use effectively. You're talking in your sentence that contains 10 words, you make a mistake in the third word and then you break down and you stop. I've seen people go and they're saying things like, I went to go, do not do that. When you do that, you're already assessing yourself. It is the job of the examiner to assess your communicative competence. It is not your job to assess your mistakes. If you make a mistake and you can identify that you've made a mistake, take a pause and correct it. If you cannot correct it or you cannot identify that you made a mistake, please put on your strong face and move on and just roll through that question, roll through that sentence and continue. If you are talking and you get stuck looking for a particular word or vocabulary item, please stop that sentence and pick up a new thread of thought and continue with that. Do not allow vocabulary items to keep you stuck, and do not allow mistakes to drop or truncate your flow in the speaking test. Do not use too many ums, ahs, and speech fillers. We call them speech fillers because they are meant to just fill in the blank spaces in your utterances. A lot of us here in Africa use speech fillers a lot, and we consider them a sign of wealth or a sign of affluence. But in the speaking part of the IELTS, it will fail you. So consciously reduce the number of speech fillers that you use in the IELTS, as it will not only reduce the quality of your answers, it will also make you less audible, and it will also affect your fluency. Do not use too many speech fillers. A lot of us also do not consider some things that are speech fillers to be speech fillers. Things like, is like, you know. These are speech fillers that are very common in the part of the world that I come from, and these are things that you must avoid when you are taking the speaking test in the IELTS. You should also avoid using things like I think. Remember, in the speaking part 3, although it's an opinion question, they are still looking at it from a general perspective. And if you keep on using words like I think, you're only going to be answering those questions based on your personal experience or your personal opinion. You also want to broaden the scope of your opinion and make it seem as if this is a general opinion, or this is much of a general thing than just something that you personally or individually subscribe to. Also, there's a very easy tip that a lot of people use when they are stuck with questions. So you are asked a question and you do not know what to say. You're completely clueless about it. Instead of just pausing and just freezing and just getting stuck without saying anything, a lot of people use this. They call it like a stopgap before they start answering. They say things like, "That's an interesting question," or they say things like, "That's an amazing question," or they say things like, "That's a good question." Well, this is actually a very good ploy or a good strategy to keep you from being stuck when you don't know what to say. You do not want to overdo it. If you're given 8 questions in your speaking part 3, and 7 out of 8 questions you start with, "That's a good question, that's a good question, that's a good question," the next thing the examiner is going to be wondering is there ever a bad question? You do not want to do this. So, as much as possible, balance your need to use speech fillers, balance your need to use all those tips, all those, I'll call them conversation crutches that you can lean on when you are falling. Balance your need to use them with your need to give a very robust and clearly communicative experience in your speaking test. Also, you also should not worry if you have an accent. I've said this before and I'll repeat it again. Your accent, although shouldn't be so horrible or atrocious that you become unintelligible, you should not bother yourself too much about your accent, because it has taken you years and years to build that accent, and you're not going to discard it in the 1 month or couple of weeks that you're preparing for the IELTS. Finally, do not worry if you make mistakes. Mistakes are a common aspect of communication. Everybody makes mistakes. I'm very sure that in the course of this video, I've made like a couple of mistakes that you will probably pause and just laugh and say, "He's our speaking examiner, or he's our IELTS tutor, and he's making this kind of mistakes." Mistakes are an essential part of communication, as no one is above making mistakes. What you want to do is to pick yourself up after you make a mistake, correct it if you know the correct form. If you do not know the correct form, continue your conversation and do not allow it to affect your utterances. Finally, prepare. There's no substitute for preparation and practice. The speaking test, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, is one of the easiest aspects in the IELTS to prepare for, with the use of modern technology like phones, which have voice recorders that you can record your answers. You can play it out for your tutor later on, or you can even play it out for your accountability partner, who could be a friend or your spouse, or you can even listen to it yourself to see how you sound and improve on the areas that you do not like your expressions. Finally, I wish you all the best in the IELTS, and I can assure you that if you use this video religiously and you practice these tips diligently, you will achieve that desired score, which is a band 9 in the IELTS.